Husband's mistress tried to fight me at school pickup. Other moms jumped her. "He's mine now, you pathetic old hag." Those were the words that echoed across Lincoln Elementary's pickup zone at exactly 3:17 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, coming from the mouth of a bleach blonde woman in her late 20s who I'd never seen before in my life. She was screaming at me while jabbing her acrylic nail toward my face, her voice so shrill that conversation stopped and heads turned from every direction. "My name is Hannah Mitchell. I'm 38 years old, and I work as a senior financial auditor for Morrison & Associates here in suburban Atlanta. I've been picking up my twin daughters from the same school for the past 4 years, and I've never been one for drama or confrontation. But standing there in my navy blazer and sensible flats, watching this stranger publicly claim ownership of my husband of 12 years, something cold and calculating settled into place behind my ribs. I didn't scream back. I didn't cry. I simply looked at her calmly and said, 'I'm sorry, but I think you have me confused with someone else.' That's when she pulled out her phone and started showing me photos that made my blood run cold. The woman's name, I would later learn, was Tiffany Brooks. She was 26, worked as a receptionist at Mark's accounting firm, and according to the photos she was proudly displaying, had been intimate with my husband in what appeared to be a hotel room. But these weren't just casual snapshots. These were dozens of images spanning what looked like months, including some taken in my own home while I was traveling for work. "Marcus told me all about you," she sneered, her voice carrying across the pickup area where other mothers had started to gather. "How you're never home, how you care more about your job than your family, how he's been miserable for years. Well, guess what? He's filing for divorce and I'm going to be the new Mrs. Mitchell." The irony wasn't lost on me that she was claiming. I cared more about work while simultaneously planning to destroy my children's stability. But I've learned in my 16 years as a financial auditor that the best response to chaos is documentation and methodical investigation. "That's interesting," I said quietly, pulling out my own phone. "Would you mind repeating that for my recording?" Her face went white. "You can't record me." "Actually, Georgia is a one-party consent state for recordings," I replied, my voice steady. "But don't worry, I'm sure the other parents here would be happy to serve as witnesses if needed." That's when I noticed something that would change everything. Margaret Chen, another mom whose daughter was friends with mine, was discreetly filming the entire confrontation from near the school entrance. She caught my eye and nodded almost imperceptibly. I'd always gotten along well with the parent community at Lincoln Elementary. While other parents gossiped or formed cliques, I'd spent 4 years quietly helping with fundraisers, using my financial background to audit the PTA books for free, and even helping several families navigate complicated tax situations during divorce proceedings. I wasn't the most social parent, but I was known as reliable and trustworthy. Tiffany, however, had severely miscalculated her audience. "So you're the homewrecker," came a voice from behind her. It was Patricia Williams, a family law attorney, whose son was in my daughter's class. She'd positioned herself directly behind Tiffany, arms crossed. "I've heard about you." "This isn't your business," Tiffany snapped, whirling around. "Actually, it became my business when you decided to have this conversation in front of all our children," Patricia replied coolly, "including Hannah's daughters, who are probably wondering why a strange woman is screaming at their mother." That's when I realized my twins, Emma and Sophie, were indeed standing nearby with their friend group, their faces confused and starting to show distress. The mama bear instinct that had been dormant suddenly roared to life. "Girls, go wait by Mrs. Chen," I called to them, my voice still calm but carrying the tone they knew meant business. "I'll be right there." But Tiffany wasn't done. If anything, seeing my children seemed to embolden her further. "Those girls better get used to seeing me around," she declared loudly, "because I'm going to be their new stepmom real soon. Marcus and I are planning to get married as soon as this divorce is final, and we're already looking at houses. He says the girls need a younger, more energetic mother figure anyway." The words hit like physical blows, but my audit training kicked in. In complex fraud investigations, the perpetrator almost always reveals more than they intend when they're feeling confident. So I let her talk. "He's been staying at my apartment 3 nights a week for the past 6 months, she continued, clearly enjoying what she perceived as my stunned silence. "He tells me everything about your marriage, how you haven't been intimate in over a year, how you're always traveling, how you never cook or clean because you think you're too good for housework." 6 months, I repeated quietly, my mind already calculating. "That would be since around March?" "That's right," she said proudly. "Right after you went on that big business trip to Chicago. He was so lonely, and I was there to comfort him." The Chicago trip. I remembered it well because it had been particularly stressful, a major audit that required me to be away for 10 days. Mark had seemed supportive, even encouraging me to take the assignment because it came with a substantial bonus. He'd handled school pickups, made dinner for the girls, and texted me sweet messages every night about how proud he was of my success. Apparently, he'd also been laying the groundwork for an affair. That must have been difficult, I said, still maintaining my calm demeanor, having to sneak around all this time. Oh, we stopped sneaking around weeks ago, Tiffany laughed. He doesn't even try to hide it anymore. Last weekend when you were at your sister's wedding, we spent the whole weekend together. He even introduced me to his buddy Jake as his girlfriend, Jake Peterson, Mark's college roommate and the best man at our wedding. They played golf together every Saturday morning and had been friends for 15 years. If Mark was introducing Tiffany to Jake as his girlfriend, this was far more serious than a simple affair. But something else was bothering me. Something about her timeline and the details she was sharing. In my experience, people who lie often can't resist embellishing their stories, and embellishments are where the cracks usually appear. It sounds like you two have been very thorough in your planning, I observed. We have been, she said, her confidence growing with what she perceived as my acceptance of the situation. Marcus showed me your financial statements, you know. Once he gets half of everything in the divorce, we'll have more than enough to start our new life together. He says you've been hiding money anyway, so his lawyer is going to demand a full forensic audit of all your accounts. There it was. The crack I'd been waiting for. Because Marcus Mitchell, my husband of 12 years, didn't have access to my financial statements. While we had joint checking and savings accounts, my investment, portfolio, retirement accounts, and the inheritance I'd received from my grandmother 3 years ago were all in my name only. I'd kept meticulous records, filed separate tax returns for my investment income, and had never given Mark access to those account details. If Tiffany knew about my financial information, it meant one of two things. Either Mark had been going through my private papers and files, or someone else was involved in this situation. Someone with knowledge of financial systems and legal procedures. My mind started racing through possibilities, but I was interrupted by the sound of approaching sirens. Did someone call the police? Tiffany asked, sounding nervous for the first time. I did, said Margaret Chen, stepping forward with her phone still recording. When you started making threats and causing a public disturbance on school property, the school resource officer requested backup when parents started calling the office about the shouting. I wasn't making threats, Tiffany protested. Actually, Patricia Williams interjected, declaring your intention to take someone's children and become their new stepmom against their will, combined with your aggressive behavior, could be interpreted as threatening conduct, especially when it's happening on elementary school grounds. 2 officers approached our group, and I recognized one of them, Officer Rodriguez, who'd given a safety presentation to the 3rd grade classes earlier in the year. He took one look at the crowd of agitated parents and the obvious tension in the situation, and immediately began separating people to get statements. Ma'am, he said to me, can you tell me what happened here? I gave him a clear, factual account of the confrontation, including Tiffany's claims about my husband and her stated intentions regarding my children. I didn't embellish or add emotional commentary, just the facts, delivered in the same professional tone I used when presenting audit findings to corporate boards. When it was Tiffany's turn to speak, she immediately began backtracking her earlier statements. I never threatened anyone, she insisted. I was just trying to have a conversation with her about the situation between me and her husband. It's not my fault she can't handle the truth about her marriage. But Margaret Chen had captured the entire confrontation on video, and several other parents had overheard her specific statements about the children. When Officer Rodriguez asked if anyone could corroborate the details of what was said, 6 different parents stepped forward as witnesses. Ma'am, Officer Rodriguez said to Tiffany, I need to inform you that causing a public disturbance on school property, especially involving minor children, is a serious matter. Given the nature of your statements and the number of witnesses, I'm going to need you to come with me to the station. This is ridiculous, Tiffany shouted. She's the one recording people without permission. Actually, Patricia Williams interjected, producing what appeared to be a business card. As I mentioned earlier, Georgia is a one-party consent state for recordings. Mrs. Mitchell was legally entitled to record your conversation. However, your behavior has been disruptive to a school environment and distressing to minor children, which are both actionable offenses. As Officer Rodriguez began reading Tiffany her rights for disorderly conduct, I noticed several parents filming with their phones. Margaret Chen was still recording, and I could see at least 3 other phones pointed in our direction. "This is going to be all over Facebook by tonight," murmured one of the moms standing nearby. She was wrong. It wasn't Facebook that made the video famous. Margaret Chen, it turned out, had a daughter who was very active on TikTok. Within 2 hours of the school parking lot confrontation, a carefully edited version of the incident had been posted with the caption, "Karen tries to steal someone's husband and kids, gets arrested at elementary school pickup." The video captured Tiffany's most outrageous statements. The moment when the other moms formed a protective circle around me, and her being led away in handcuffs while still shouting about how unfair everything was. By the time I got home that evening, my phone was buzzing with notifications. The video had been shared across multiple platforms and was rapidly gaining views. But I had bigger concerns than social media fame. Mark was waiting for me in the kitchen when I walked in with the girls, and his face was a mask of barely contained panic. "Hannah, we need to talk," he said, his voice tight. "There's been a misunderstanding." "Girls, go upstairs and start your homework," I said calmly. "Daddy and I need to have a conversation." Once Emma and Sophie were out of earshot, I turned to face my husband of 12 years. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past few hours, and there was a desperate quality to his expression that I'd never seen before. "Let me explain," he began, but I held up my hand. "Actually, Mark, I think your girlfriend explained quite thoroughly this afternoon. In front of our children, I might add." "She's not my girlfriend," he said quickly. "I mean, it's complicated, but it's not what you think." "What I think," I said, settling into my chair at the kitchen table, "is that you've been having an affair. For 6 months, you've been sharing privileged information about our finances, and you've been planning to divorce me. Am I incorrect about any of those facts?" Mark's face went through several expressions before settling on defeated resignation. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "I've suspected something was off for about 8 weeks," I replied honestly. "You've been distant, secretive about your phone, working late more often, and frankly, you've seemed happier than you've been in years. I assumed you were either having a midlife crisis or an affair. I was hoping for the midlife crisis." "Hannah, I'm sorry, I never meant for you to find out like this." "No, you meant for me to find out when you served me with divorce papers," I said. "What I'm curious about is how Tiffany knew details about my personal financial accounts that even you don't have access to." Mark's face went white. "What do you mean?" "She mentioned that you told her about my investment portfolio and inheritance accounts. But Marcus, you've never seen those statements. I handle all of that separately, and it's never been part of our joint finances. So either you've been going through my private files, or someone else has been feeding her information." The silence stretched between us for nearly a full minute. "I may have mentioned some things to Jake," he finally admitted. "He's been helping me understand what to expect in terms of asset division." Jake Peterson. The pieces were starting to form a picture I didn't like. "Jake Peterson, who works as a financial advisor for Meridian Wealth Management," I said slowly. "The same firm that handles the 401k accounts for Morrison and Associates." Mark nodded miserably. "And Jake, who would have professional access to employee account information if he really wanted to dig for it." Another nod. I felt that familiar cold calculation settling into place again. In complex fraud cases, there's often a moment when you realize the scope of the problem is much larger than initially apparent. This was one of those moments. "Mark, I need you to be very honest with me about something. Is this just about an affair and a divorce, or is there something more going on here?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, is Jake Peterson helping you plan a divorce, or is he helping you plan something else entirely?" Mark's hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Over the next hour, I extracted the full story from my husband. It was worse than I'd imagined. Jake Peterson had indeed been the architect of a much larger scheme. He'd convinced Mark that I was hiding assets from our marriage and that a forensic audit would reveal undisclosed accounts that could be claimed in a divorce settlement. More troubling, Jake had suggested that Mark could borrow against my retirement accounts before filing for divorce, essentially liquidating my investments to fund his new life with Tiffany. He said it was all legal, Mark insisted. He said, "Since we're married, I have a right to access those funds, especially if I could prove you were hiding income." "Mark, that's not just wrong, it's potentially criminal. Those accounts aren't marital property, and accessing them without authorization would be fraud and theft." But Jake said what he needed to say to convince you to commit financial crimes that he could then cover up or manipulate to his advantage. Did it ever occur to you to wonder what Jake was getting out of this arrangement? Based on Mark's expression, it clearly hadn't. He's been charging you for financial advice, hasn't he? Probably substantial fees for divorce planning and asset Protection services? Mark nodded slowly. He said it was an investment in my future. And I'll bet he's been encouraging you to move money around, maybe suggesting specific accounts or investment strategies? Another nod. Mark, I think you've been the victim of a sophisticated financial manipulation scheme. Jake has been using your affair and your desire for a divorce to convince you to commit crimes that would benefit him financially, while destroying both of our lives. The more we talked, the clearer the picture became. Jake had been feeding Mark information about my accounts that he'd obtained through his professional access. He'd been charging Mark substantial fees for legal advice, despite not being an attorney. He'd been encouraging Mark to take actions that would have resulted in criminal charges for both of them, while positioning himself to benefit from the resulting chaos. And Tiffany, I was beginning to suspect, wasn't just an innocent receptionist who'd fallen for my husband. Mark, how did you meet Tiffany? At the office, like I said. But how specifically? Did she approach you or did you approach her? She started bringing me coffee in the mornings about 8 months ago. Said she'd noticed I seemed stressed and thought I could use some extra caffeine. 8 months ago. That would be January. 2 months before your affair allegedly started. I guess so. And who introduced you to Jake's divorce planning services? Marky was quiet for a long moment. Actually, it was Tiffany. She said she had a friend who specialized in helping men protect their assets during divorce proceedings. There it was. The full scope of the conspiracy. Tiffany hadn't stumbled into an affair with my husband. She'd been systematically cultivating a relationship with him for months, building trust and emotional dependence, all while feeding him to Jake Peterson's financial manipulation scheme. The affair was just the delivery mechanism for a much more sophisticated fraud. Mark, I said quietly, I think you need to understand that you haven't just been cheating on me. You've been the target of an organized financial crime, and they've been using your emotions to manipulate you into becoming an accomplice. That's impossible, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Let's think about this logically. A young, attractive woman suddenly takes interest in a married man in his 40s. She slowly builds an emotional connection, then introduces him to her friend who just happens to be a financial advisor with access to his wife's confidential account information. The advisor then convinces the husband that his wife is hiding money and that he's entitled to access funds that are legally hers alone. Meanwhile, the advisor is charging substantial fees for illegal advice while positioning himself to profit from the resulting financial chaos. Mark was silent as the implications sank in. And then, I continued, when the wife starts getting suspicious, the girlfriend creates a very public, very dramatic confrontation that ensures the affair becomes public knowledge, forcing the husband's hand on filing for divorce before he's had time to think about whether this is really what he wants. You think this was all planned? Mark, I think you've been the mark in a sophisticated con game, and today's scene at the school was supposed to be the point of no return. They needed our marriage to implode publicly and dramatically so you'd have no choice but to move forward with their financial scheme. But if that had been their plan, they'd seriously underestimated who they were dealing with. I'd spent 16 years investigating financial crimes for a living. I knew how to trace money trails, how to document fraud, and how to build cases that would hold up in court. More importantly, I knew how to do it quietly and methodically while the perpetrators remained convinced they were getting away with their scheme. Mark, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Do you actually want a divorce, or do you want out of this situation you found yourself in? He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands folded on the kitchen table. I don't know, he finally said. 6 months ago, I thought I wanted out of our marriage. You're gone so much for work, and I felt like we were more like roommates than spouses. When Tiffany started paying attention to me, it felt like someone actually saw me and valued me. And now? Now I'm wondering if I've been seeing the situation clearly. Over the past month, she's become more demanding and possessive. She wants me to guarantee timelines for when I'll file for divorce, when we'll get married, how much money we'll have. It stopped feeling romantic and started feeling like a business transaction. Because it is a business transaction, Mark, you're the product being sold. We talked until nearly midnight, and by the end of our conversation, we'd agreed on a plan. Mark wasn't ready to admit that our marriage could be saved, and honestly, I wasn't sure it could be either. But we both agreed that Emma and Sophie deserved better than to have their family destroyed by financial criminals using their father as a pawn. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years and started making phone calls. My first call was to Patricia Williams, the family law attorney who'd witnessed yesterday's confrontation. I explained the situation in detail, and asked if she'd be willing to represent me in what was likely to become a complex case involving both family law and financial crimes. "Hannah, this is actually more common than you might think," she told me during our consultation. "There are organized groups that specifically target middle-aged men going through marital difficulties. They use romance and financial manipulation to convince the targets to commit crimes that benefit the organizers. The victims often don't realize they're being manipulated until they're facing criminal charges. What's our best course of action? Document everything, cooperate with law enforcement, and protect your assets immediately. I'm going to refer you to a forensic accountant who specializes in financial fraud cases, and we need to get injunctions in place to prevent any unauthorized access to your accounts." My second call was to the Georgia Department of Banking and Finance to report suspected financial advisor misconduct. Jake Peterson's use of his professional access to obtain confidential account information was a serious violation of state regulations regardless of any other crimes he might have committed. My third call was to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Agent Rebecca Torres met with me that afternoon in her downtown Atlanta office. She was a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in complex financial fraud cases, and she listened to my story with the kind of focused attention that told me she'd seen similar situations before. "Mrs. Mitchell, what you're describing sounds like a variation of what we call a honey trap scheme," she explained. "Organized criminals identify targets with access to money or financial information, then use romantic manipulation to gain access to accounts or convince targets to commit financial crimes. It's particularly common in cases involving divorce proceedings because emotions are high and people make impulsive decisions. Is this something you can investigate?" "Absolutely. The interstate nature of the financial transactions, the use of professional credentials to commit fraud, and the organized nature of the scheme all fall under federal jurisdiction. But I need to ask, are you prepared for this investigation to potentially result in criminal charges against your husband?" That was the question I'd been dreading. "Agent Torres, my husband made bad choices, but I believe he was manipulated into making them. I'm more interested in stopping the people who are running this scheme than in punishing their victims." That's understandable, and cooperation from victims often leads to better outcomes for everyone involved. "Would your husband be willing to work with us?" I believe he would. That evening, I sat down with Mark and explained what I'd learned during my consultations with the attorney and the FBI agent. His face went through a range of emotions as the full scope of his situation became clear. "You mean I could go to prison?" "It's possible if you were to follow through with accessing my accounts illegally. But if you cooperate with the investigation and help build a case against Jake and Tiffany, the prosecutors are usually willing to work with victims who've been manipulated. What do I have to do?" "First, you need to cut off all contact with both of them immediately. No phone calls, no text messages, no meetings. Second, you need to document every interaction you've had with Jake regarding financial advice, including any fee payments or documents he's given you. Third, you'll likely be asked to participate in recorded conversations to gather evidence." "You mean wear a wire?" "Possibly. The FBI will explain the options." Mark was quiet for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what he'd gotten involved in. "Hannah, why are you helping me? After everything I've done, you'd be justified in just letting me face the consequences alone." It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since this whole situation began. "Because Emma and Sophie need their father," I said finally. "And because the people who did this to you are probably doing it to other families too. If we can stop them, maybe we can prevent other children from going through what our daughters are about to experience." "Does this mean you want to try to save our marriage?" "I honestly don't know, Mark. I think we have a lot of work to do, individually and together, before we can answer that question. But right now, I want to focus on protecting our family and making sure the people responsible for this manipulation face consequences." The next few weeks were intense. Mark met with Agent Torres and agreed to cooperate fully with the FBI investigation. The forensic accountant Patricia had referred me to began analyzing all of our financial records to document any unauthorized access or manipulation. And I quietly began my own investigation into Tiffany Brooks and her background. What I found was illuminating. Tiffany Brooks wasn't just a receptionist at Mark's accounting firm. She'd worked at 4 different companies over the past 3 years, always in administrative roles that gave her access to employee information, and always leaving under circumstances that weren't entirely clear. More interesting, in each case, she'd left shortly after a married male employee had gone through a messy divorce involving disputed finances. At her previous job, she'd dated a married manager for 8 months before he filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. During the divorce proceedings, there had been allegations of hidden assets and financial misconduct, resulting in a lengthy legal battle that had financially ruined both spouses. Tiffany had moved on to her next job 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized. The pattern was consistent across multiple jobs and relationships. She would identify married men with access to money, cultivate relationships over several months, introduce them to financial advisors who would encourage questionable financial decisions, and then disappear once the legal and financial chaos reached its peak. But this time, she'd made a crucial mistake. She'd created a public confrontation that had been recorded and widely shared, making her face and her methods visible to potential future victims and law enforcement. The viral video from the school pickup had indeed reached over 10 million views across various platforms, but more importantly, it had been seen by other women who'd had similar experiences. Agent Torres called me 3 weeks after our initial meeting with an update that was both encouraging and disturbing. "Mrs. Mitchell, your case has opened up a much larger investigation. We've been contacted by law enforcement in 4 other states about similar schemes involving Jake Peterson and associates. It appears your husband wasn't the only target. How many other families are involved?" "At least 12 that we've identified so far, possibly more. The financial losses in some cases have been substantial. We're talking about families who've lost their entire retirement savings and children's college funds. The scope of the damage was staggering. This wasn't just about my marriage or even my family. It was about a criminal organization that had been systematically destroying families for financial gain. What happens next? We're preparing to make arrests. Jake Peterson will be charged with multiple counts of financial fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Tiffany Brooks will be charged as an accomplice. But we need your husband's continued cooperation to make sure we have enough evidence for convictions." Mark had been meeting with FBI agents twice a week, providing detailed information about his interactions with both Jake and Tiffany. He'd turned over all financial records, text messages, and emails. He'd even agreed to make several recorded phone calls to Jake to discuss next steps in the divorce proceedings. The recordings were damning. Jake had been explicitly encouraging Mark to access my accounts without authorization, to liquid assets, before filing for divorce, and to hide the proceeds in accounts that Jake would manage for a fee. He'd also made statements that proved he'd been using his professional credentials to access confidential financial information without authorization. On a Thursday morning in late October, 6 weeks after the school parking lot confrontation, Agent Torres called to let me know that arrests had been made. Jake Peterson had been arrested at his office and charged with multiple federal crimes. Tiffany Brooks had been arrested at her apartment and charged as an accomplice. Several other associates in different states had also been arrested as part of the coordinated investigation. The preliminary evidence suggests this organization has stolen or manipulated several $1 million over the past 5 years. Agent Torres told me, "Your willingness to come forward and your husband's cooperation have been instrumental in building cases that should result in significant prison sentences. But the personal cost had been substantial. Mark and I had begun marriage counseling, but we were still living separately while we worked through the damage that had been done to our relationship. Emma and Sophie were seeing a child psychologist to help them process the changes in their family structure, and I was still dealing with the aftermath of having my private life become internet famous. The viral video had brought media attention that I never wanted. I'd been contacted by journalists, bloggers, and even television producers interested in telling my story. I'd declined all interviews, but the attention had been overwhelming and intrusive. More positively, I'd also been contacted by other women who'd been through similar experiences. Some had recognized the patterns in their own relationships after seeing the video and reading the news coverage of the arrests. Others had simply wanted to share their own stories of financial manipulation and marital betrayal. Patricia Williams, my attorney, suggested that I consider speaking publicly about the experience as a way to help other families identify and avoid similar schemes. "Hannah, you have a unique perspective on this type of crime because of your professional background and the way you handled the situation," she told me during one of our meetings. "Other women facing similar situations might benefit from hearing your story." I wasn't sure I was ready for that level of public exposure, but I was beginning to understand that my experience was part of a much larger pattern of crimes that were destroying families across the country. 6 months after the school parking lot confrontation, I made my first public speaking appearance at a conference for family law attorneys. My presentation was titled "Financial Red Flags in Divorce Proceedings: Identifying Organized Manipulation Schemes." The response was overwhelming. Attorneys from across the country shared stories of clients who'd been victims of similar schemes. Financial advisors talked about colleagues who'd been using their professional access inappropriately, and other wives and mothers shared their own experiences with manipulation and financial abuse. The speech was recorded and posted online where It quickly gained attention in legal and financial professional circles. Within weeks, I was being invited to speak at law enforcement conferences, professional development seminars, and victim advocacy events. I'd never intended to become a public speaker or advocate, but the experience had given me a platform to help other families avoid the trauma that mine had endured. Jake Peterson was eventually sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to his victims. Tiffany Brooks received 4 years and was banned from working in any position that gave her access to confidential employee information. Several other members of the organization received various sentences ranging from probation to 6 years imprisonment. The total financial recovery for victims was substantial, though many families had suffered damage that couldn't be repaired with money alone. Mark and I ultimately decided to divorce, but we did it amicably and with focus on co-parenting Emma and Sophie effectively. He'd learned difficult lessons about manipulation and trust, and I'd learned that my work-focused lifestyle had contributed to problems in our marriage that I'd been too busy to notice. We both agreed that we were better people for having gone through the experience, even though we weren't better together as spouses. The viral video that had started everything eventually faded from internet attention, replaced by newer content and different controversies. But the changes it had brought to my life were permanent. I left my position at Morrison & Associates and started my own consulting firm specializing in financial fraud investigation and prevention. My unique combination of audit experience and personal experience with financial manipulation made me valuable to law enforcement agencies, attorneys, and other professionals dealing with similar cases. Emma and Sophie adjusted well to their new family structure. They were proud that their mother had helped catch bad guys and protect other families. They also maintained a good relationship with their father, who had worked hard to rebuild their trust and demonstrate that he'd learned from his mistakes. 2 years after the parking lot confrontation, I received a message through my business website from a woman in Colorado. "Mrs. Mitchell, I saw your story online and I think something similar might be happening to me. My husband has been acting strangely and he's been getting financial advice from someone who seems to know a lot about my personal accounts. I don't know who else to ask for help." I spent an hour on the phone with her, helping her identify red flags and connecting her with appropriate resources in her area. By the time we hung up, she had a plan to protect herself and her children while gathering evidence of the suspected manipulation. 3 weeks later, she emailed to let me know that her husband's financial advisor had been arrested for fraud, and that her husband was cooperating with authorities as a victim rather than facing charges as a perpetrator. "You saved my family," she wrote. "I can't thank you enough." That email reminded me why the whole painful experience had been worth it. Karma doesn't always require revenge. Sometimes it just requires patience, documentation, and the determination to make sure the truth comes to light. The people who tried to destroy my family for their own financial gain are now serving prison sentences. The victims they manipulated have received justice and restitution, and other families have been spared similar trauma because the scheme has been exposed and disrupted. As for me, I've learned that sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the most important discoveries about who you really are and what you're capable of accomplishing. I never could have imagined that a screaming confrontation in an elementary school parking lot would lead to a federal investigation, a new career, and a platform to help other families protect themselves from financial predators. But I'm grateful that when Tiffany Brooks decided to publicly claim she was taking my husband and my children, she chose to do it in front of a community of parents who had my back and in the age of smartphones and social media. Sometimes justice needs a little help going viral, and sometimes the best revenge is simply making sure the truth gets told.